Daily quests are now reset.
Spellstorm Dark Sorrow says, streets won't forget. Spellstorm Dark Sorrow says, student of the game.
Who you be?
Quest accepted, a time to reflect.
Elomon.
Let us test your knowledge of history, then. What was the name of the human who helped Thrall escape his imprisonment in Durnholder Keep?
Later,
Spellstorm Dark Sorrow says, pace and power. Let us test your knowledge of history, then. What was in the chalice of rebirth that Gul'dan offered the orcs?
See ya later. Okie dokie.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X5.
A time to reflect completed. Received 93 gold, 60 silver.
Spellstorm Dark Sorrow says, he knows ball. Spellstorm Dark Sorrow says, Techi player.
Relax. You be careful now. How are you? Spirits be with you, man.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X250. Sugarkit transferred Time Warp Badge X250 to Sugarkit.
At the storyteller's stage.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X255. Bubalechi transferred Time Warp Badge X255 to Sugarkit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X260. Palaki transferred Time Warp Badge X260 to Sugarkit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X260. Dith Comshare transferred Time Warp Badge X260 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X260. DeathG transferred Time Warp Badge X260 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X265. Voichi transferred Time Warp Badge X265 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X265. Puffchi transferred Time Warp Badge X265 to SugarKit. Spellstorm Dark Sarau says, he's a pace and power player. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X270. SugarKit transferred Time Warp Badge X270 to SugarKit. Spellstorm Dark Sarau says, Techi Baller. Spellstorm Dark Sarau says, streets won't forget. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X275. Yubiyu transferred Time Warp Badge X275 to SugarKit. Spellstorm Dark Sarau says, he's got tech. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X290. SugarKit transferred Time Warp Badge X290 to SugarKit. Spellstorm Dark Sarau says, pace and power player. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X305. Morgchi transferred Time Warp Badge X305 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X310. SugarKit transferred Time Warp Badge X310 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X310. Frozenkai transferred Time Warp Badge X310 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X925. SugarKit transferred Time Warp Badge X925 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X630. Shumchi transferred Time Warp Badge X630 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X610. Lilwerkit transferred Time Warp Badge X610 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X330. SugarKit transferred Time Warp Badge X330 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X320. Palaki transferred Time Warp Badge X320 to SugarKit.
For those with a passion for silk, leather, and steel, the frenzy of fashion is all too real. Be seen by the masses, be their envy, their desire. Become the example to which all others aspire.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X345. Dethia transferred Time Warp Badge X345 to SugarKit. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X340.
What you looking for?
Bubalechi transferred Time Warp Badge X340 to SugarKit. You receive item, Illidari Doomhawk.
Bye bye now.
You have added the Mount Illidare Doom Hawk to your collection. You have earned the title Countess Sugarkey. You have earned the title Sinita Sugarkey.
Calling all fashionistas to strut their stuff in the fashion frenzy!
I have all the time in the Isles. I will see you again. This is when
Quest
you
accepted, an original path through time. You are now queued in the Dungeon Finder. Dungeon difficulty set to time walking. Genji is now the leader of your group.
Genji Drainer receives loot, Mage Weave Cloth. The Big Bum Outland receives loot, Bone Fragments. The Big Bum Outland receives loot, Crochet Shoulder Pads. The Big Bum Outland receives loot, Night Crawlers. Genji Drainer receives loot, Dusk Woven Sash of the Aurora. The Big Bum Outland says, interrupted Baroness Anastory's Banshee Wail.
The big boom has died.
The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Warmonger's pauldrons of the Aurora. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Night Crawlers. Genji Drainer receives loot. Keening Stone. You receive currency. Time Warp Badge X10. Genji Drainer receives loot. Crescent Edge of the Quick Blade. You receive loot. Night Crawlers. Genji Drainer receives loot. Anastari Heirloom. You receive loot. Shadow Silk. You receive loot. Dripping Spider Mandible. You receive loot. Crypt Fiend Parts 3. You loot 38 gold, 64 silver, 15 copper. You receive loot. Crescent Edge of the Quick Blade. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 2. The Big Boom Outland says, just keep moving, man. The Big Boom, look here. The Big Boom Outland says, interrupted Thuzaden Shadowcaster's Shadow Bolt. You loot 16 gold, 90 silver, 25 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot. Dripping Spider Mandible. Genji Drainer receives loot. Crypt Fiend Parts. Genji Drainer receives loot. Shadow Silk. Genji Drainer receives loot. Dripping Spider Mandible. Genji Drainer receives loot. Crypt Fiend Parts 5. You receive loot. Crypt Fiend Parts 3. You receive currency. Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot. Mage Weave Cloths 3. You receive loot. Itcher of Undeath. You receive loot. Eye of Arachnida. You receive loot. Morning Glory Dew. You loot 27 gold, 20 silver, 34 copper. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Thick Spider's Silk. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Dark Spinner Claws. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Crypt Fiend Parts 4. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Eye of Arachnida. Genji Drainer receives loot. Hibernal Sphere. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 3. Twisting Nether receives loot. Strat Alm Holy Waters 2. The Big Boom Outland says, interrupted Thuzaden Necromancer's Soul Tap. The Big Boom Outland says, interrupted Malky the Palad's Ice Tomb. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Duskwoven Amice of the Quick Blade. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 4. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Itcher of Undeath. The Big Boom Outland receives loot. Night Crawlers. Twisting Nether receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 6. Twisting Nether receives loot. Itcher of Undeath. Twisting Nether receives loot. Thick Leather Shoulder Pads. You receive currency. Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot. Mage Weave Cloths 12. You receive loot. Major Healing Potion. You receive loot. Crochet Bracers. You receive loot. Pale Moon Cloak. You loot 55 gold, 66 silver, 87 copper. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Stratholm Holy Waters 2. You receive loot, Mageweave Cloths 4. You loot 15 gold, 39 silver, 31 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot, Key to the City. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Royal Tribunal Cloak. Genji Drainer receives loot, Royal Tribunal Cloak. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Essence of Undeath. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Key to the City. You receive loot, Key to the City. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 30 gold, 66 silver, 68 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot, Dried King Boleth. You receive loot, Major Healing Potion. You loot 3 gold, 17 silver, 99 copper. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Valorous Helm. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Frayed Abomination Stitching. Genji Drainer receives loot, Frayed Abomination Stitching. Twisting Nether receives loot, Frayed Abomination Stitching. You receive loot, Frayed Abomination Stitching. GCD Stormscale receives loot, Band of Flesh. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot, Band of Flesh. You loot 25 gold, 76 silver, 61 copper. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive currency, Bronze Celebration Tokens 2. Genji Drainer receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X20. Genji Drainer receives loot, Cape of the Black Baron. You receive currency, Valor Stonus 20. You receive loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll.
Quest accepted, the Ancient Scroll.
You receive loot, Thick Leather Gloves. You loot 35 gold, 50 silver, 45 copper. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Dreadblade of the Fire Flash. You receive currency, Weathered Harbinger Crests 5. Thievigbum Outland receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. GCD Stormscale receives loot, Scepter of the Unholy.
Thievigbum Outland has left the instance group. A role check has been initiated. Your group will be queued when all members have selected a role. Dada Twisting Nether has chosen Tank. A role check has been initiated. Your group will be queued when all members have selected a role. Dada Twisting Nether has chosen Tank. Your group leader has cancelled the role check. Genjidrana has chosen Damage. GCD Stormscale has chosen Healer. Sugarkey has chosen Damage. You are now queued in the Dungeon Finder.
GCD Stormscale receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll.
Dada Twisting Nether has left the instance group. Dungeon difficulty set to time walking.
Genji Drainer receives loot. Bone fragments. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 3. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 3.
Dada Twisting Nether has left the instance group. The vote to kick Dada has passed. You are now queued in the dungeon finder.
You receive loot. Mage Weave Cloth 7. You receive loot. Silk Cloths 2. You receive loot. Bone Fragments. You receive loot. Itcher of Undeath. You receive loot. Tracker's Wrist Guards of the Quick Blade. You loot 13 gold, 30 silver, 8 copper.
Salvatra Tudrana has joined the instance group.
You receive loot. Bone Fragments. You receive loot. Codex. Prayer of Fortitude. You loot 1 gold, 62 silver, 4 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot. Night Crawlers. Genji Drainer receives loot. Morning Glory Dew. Genji Drainer receives loot. Dried King Bolid. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 2. Genji Drainer receives loot. Bone Fragments 2. Genji Drainer receives loot. Morning Glory Dew. Genji Drainer receives loot. Bone Fragments. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Bone Fragments. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Splintering Battle Axe. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Reinforced Steel Lockbox. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloth. Genji Drainer receives loot. Night Crawlers. You receive loot. Bone Fragments. You loot 10 gold, 46 silver, 38 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot. Bone Fragments. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 5. Genji Drainer receives loot. Night Crawlers. Genji Drainer says, Srei. Salvatory Drainer says, NAR or good. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloth. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Rainbow Girdle. You receive loot. Star of Mist Aria. You receive currency. Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 34 gold, 14 silver, 48 copper. Genji Drainer receives loot. Overlinked Chain Cloak. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloth. Salvatory Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 3. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloths 4. Genji Drainer receives loot. Mage Weave Cloth. Vezuvka Ragnaros receives loot. Sharp short sword. Vezuvka Ragnaros receives loot, silk cloth 7. Genji Drainer receives loot, Alterac Swiss. Genji Drainer receives loot, silk cloths 2. Genji Drainer receives loot, silk cloths 2. Genji Drainer receives loot, major healing potion. Genji Drainer receives loot, mage weave cloths 2. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive currency, Bronze Celebration Token X2. Vezuvka Ragnaros receives loot, Crown of Tyranny. Salvatory Drainer receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X20. You receive currency, Valor Stonus 20. You loot 21 gold, 26 silver, 92 copper.
Genji is now the leader of your group.
Salvatory Drainer bursts into dance.
You leave the group. You are now queued in the Dungeon Finder.
Ritka Drainer says, \WA. Ritka Drainer says, \weak auras. Ritka Drainer bursts into dance.
Our flight has much to offer. I knew you would like my wares.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X500.
The ancient scroll completed. Received
Take all the
23 gold,
time you
40
need.
silver.
This is your time.
Crochet braces has been added to your appearance collection.
Settle up and put your menagerie to the test in Mount Mania!
You gained
have a bright
11
future.
gold, 69 silver,
come
79 copper.
For a Mount Mania! Quickly summon the same mount as me to earn points.
Salama
Quest
Ashalan.
accepted. Celebrate good fun.
You receive loot, Pet Mirror.
Dungeon difficulty set to time walking. Sesmore is now the leader of your group.
You receive loot, linen cloth 7. You receive loot, stonemason cloak. You loot 20 gold, 7 silver, 60 copper. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 15. Says more Tyrande receives loot, heavy stone. Says more Tyrande receives loot, birchwood maul of the quick blade. Says more Tyrande receives loot, heavy hammer. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, blackened Defias leggings.
Yarmadrud has died.
Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 4. You receive loot, linen cloths 4. You receive currency, time warp badge X10. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, wool cloths 4. You loot 9 gold, 56 silver, 16 copper. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, linen cloths 8. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, stout war staff. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, lumberjack axe. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, blackened bone necklace. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Defias rapier. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, curved dagger. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 3. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 6. Says more Tyrande receives loot, feeble shortbow. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, silk threaded trousers. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, coarse stone X3. Kurlos Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 2. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, linen cloths 2. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, wool cloth. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, linen cloth. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, watchman's boots. You receive loot, linen cloth. You loot 9 gold, 23 silver, 26 copper. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloth 6. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloth. You receive loot, linen cloths 12. You receive loot, spellbinder bracers. You receive loot, soldier's cloak. You receive loot, fire 1. You loot 23 gold, 22 silver, 83 copper. Says more Tyrande receives loot, wool cloth 7. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths 3. Says more Tyrande receives loot, metal stave. Says more Tyrande receives loot, banded leggings of the fire flash. You receive loot, wool cloths 5. You receive loot, major healing potion. You receive loot, linen cloths 5. You receive loot, jagged axe. You receive loot, smooth leather boots. You loot 43 gold, 4 copper. Says more Tyrande receives loot, wool cloths 4. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, wool cloth. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, linen cloths 24. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, blackened Defias gloves. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, smooth leather pants. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, worn mail boots. Yarmadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, woodworking gloves. Kralost Irondur receives loot, linen cloths 10. Kralost Irondur receives loot, wool cloths 4. You receive loot, wool cloths 5. You loot 18 gold, 97 silver, 90 copper. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, linen cloths 11. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, wool cloths 2. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, coarse blasting powder. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, smooth leather bracers. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, twill shoulder pads. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, handful of copper bolts 2. Kralost Irondur receives loot, smooth leather armor. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, linen cloths 4. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, lumber master's mantle. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, lumber master's mantle. You receive loot, wool cloths 4. You receive currency, time warp badge X10. Kralost Irondur receives loot, linen cloths 3. You loot 17 gold, 87 silver, 87 copper. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, linen cloths 2. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, wool cloths 3. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, calico belt. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, wool cloths 4. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, interlaced shoulder pads. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, linen cloth 7. You loot 25 gold, 25 silver, 76 copper. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, coarse blasting powder X2. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, linen cloth. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, coarse blasting powder. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, linen cloths 4. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, twill belt. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, masterwork girdle of the fire flash. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, wool cloths 2. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, adventurer's bandana of the Aurora. You receive currency, time warp badge X10. You receive loot, linen cloths 5. Kralost Irondur receives loot, lavishly jeweled ring. You loot 15 gold, 32 silver, 89 copper. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, linen cloth. You loot 8 gold, 24 silver, 99 copper. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, Defias gunpowder. Leader Sesmore, look here. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, wool cloth. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, interlaced cowl. Sesmore Irondur receives loot, wool cloth. You loot 9 gold, 6 silver, 51 copper.
Avast, you swabs! Repel the invaders!
You loot 6 gold, 82 silver, 75 copper.
You landlubbers are tougher than I thought. I'll have to improvise. Ugh. Now you're making me angry.
Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloths too. Says more Tyrande receives loot, thief's gloves. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, thief's gloves. You receive loot, linen cloths 3. Yamadrug Twisting Nether receives loot, wool cloths 6. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. Yamadrug Twisting Nether receives loot, smooth leather boots. You receive loot, wool cloths 2. You loot 17 gold, 37 silver, 31 copper. You receive loot, linen cloths 4. You loot 17 gold, 53 silver, 37 copper. You receive loot, roasted quail. You loot 16 gold, 3 silver, 10 copper. Says more Tyrande receives loot, linen cloth. You receive loot, wool cloths 2. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, linen cloths 9. You receive loot, blackened Defias belt. You loot 6 gold, 3 silver, 19 copper. Yamadrug Twisting Nether receives loot, linen cloths 9. Leader says more, threatening alert, Edwin Van Cleef.
Fools! Our cause is righteous. The Brotherhood shall prevail.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive currency, Bronze Celebration Tokens 2. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, Cape of the Brotherhood. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. Yamadrud Twisting Nether receives loot, Hogger's Trousers. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Wool Cloth.
This tell
Kralost Irondur receives loot, Corsair's Overshirt. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Linen Cloths 5. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Twill Cloak. Kralost Irondur receives loot, Wool Cloths 4.
Yamadrud Twisting Nether has left the instance group. You died.
Says more Tyrande receives loot, Wool Cloths 2. Says more Tyrande receives loot, Cat Carrier, Siamese. Says more Tyrande receives loot, Small Barnacled Clam. Says more Tyrande receives loot, Brigade Gauntlets of the Quick Blade. You receive loot, Wool Cloths 3. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot, Shiny Fish Scales. You loot 8 gold, 98 silver, 71 copper. Muahakal Stormscale receives loot, Pirate's Bracers. Kralost Irondur receives loot, Cat Carrier, Siamese. Kralost Irondur receives loot, Linen Cloths 2.
A role check has been initiated. Your group will be queued when all members have selected a role. Says more Tyrande has chosen, damage. Kralost Tyrande has chosen, damage. Sugarkey has chosen, damage. Mohawk Hill Stormscale has not selected any roles.
You loot 5 gold, 85 silver, 73 copper.
Mohawk Hill Stormscale has left the instance group. Says more Tyrande has left the instance group. Kralost Tyrande has left the instance group. You leave the group. Smooth leather boots has been added to your appearance collection. Soldier's cloak has been added to your appearance collection. Infantry boots has been added to your appearance collection.
For those with a passion for silk, leather, and steel.
My wrath flows freely.
I have many lucky doos you like.
You receive loot, pet mirror.
Sunflower. Doobie 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 doobie.
I have one-of-a-kind items. Stay the course.
You receive currency, bronze celebration tokens 3.
Celebrate good fun. Completed. Received 2 gold, 34 silver.
Raged pokes her belly and giggles.
Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created.
calling all fashionistas to strut their stuff in the fashion frenzy!
Auction created. 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 Duruzal is completely smashed from the Krieg's hardy draft. Duruzal seems to be sobering up. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created. Auction created.
I have many, many wares.
You
Good fortune
gained
to our friends.
147 gold, 1 silver, 10 copper. Spellbinder braces has been added to your appearance collection.
Crunchies, crunchies, lucky doos and root.
You gained
Farewell,
6
friend of the
copper.
Brummels.
Hail, honored guests and children of any age! A story awaits at the storyteller's stage! So stop what you're doing, and come if you're able, to hear Lore Walker Cho spin us a fable.
You are now queued in the dungeon finder.
Hello.
You receive item, Reigns of the Eclipse Dragon
Be
Hawk.
careful.
You have added the Mount Eclipse Dragon Hawk to your collection. Dungeon difficulty set to time walking. Asmongoose is now the leader of your group.
Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3.
Asmongoose is now the leader of your group. Strylsum has died.
You receive loot, Flask of Mojo. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. You loot 11 gold, 3 silver, 52 copper. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Recurve Longbow. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Resplendent Circlet of the Fire Flash. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Hawkeye Bow of the Quick Blade.
Strylsum has died.
Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Major Healing Potion. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Flask of Mojo. Asmongoose Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 4. Asmongoose Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweats 2. Asmongoose Ragnaros receives loot, Lunar Wand of the Quick Blade. You receive loot, Troll Sweats 2. You receive loot, Mage Weave Cloths 4. You receive loot, Major Healing Potion. You receive loot, Smooth Cloak. You loot 24 gold, 95 silver, 92 copper. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloth. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Vertica Wildamer receives loot, Brute Hammer of the Aurora.
Strylsum has died.
You receive loot, Troll Sweats 2. You receive loot, Flask of Mojo. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 13 gold, 84 silver, 81 copper. You loot 6 gold, 65 silver, 74 copper. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Thick Cloak. You loot 6 gold, 84 silver, 63 copper. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweats 2. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 4. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Crochet Pants. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Major Healing Potion. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Spiked Lead. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Spiked Legs 2. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Theka Seal of Vigilance. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 16 gold, 37 silver, 87 copper. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Roasted Basilisk Skin. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive loot, Lifeblood Amulet. Fast Demon Aragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. You loot 13 gold, 89 silver, 3 copper. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Flask of Mojo. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Roasted Basilisk Skinks 3. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Rigid Basilisk Fang. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Flask of Mojo. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloth. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Flask of Mojo. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 4. You receive loot, Khan's Legards. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Witch Doctor's Ritual Collar. You loot 12 gold, 76 silver, 29 copper. You receive loot, Roasted Quail. You loot 2 gold, 20 silver, 85 copper. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 5. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Primed Musket. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Vertica Wildemer says, here is 2 boss. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Flask of Mojo. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Roasted Quail. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Light Plate Helmet. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Ancient Tablet. You receive loot, Troll Sweats 2. You receive loot, Crochet Cloak. You receive loot, Twill Pants. You loot 27 gold, 72 silver, 41 copper. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Mage Weave Cloth. You receive loot, Vermilion Band of the Fire Flash. You loot 21 gold, 7 silver, 99 copper. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Big Mouth Clam. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Ancient Tablet. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloth. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 13 gold, 63 silver, 57 copper. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Gozrilla Scale Cloak.
Interface action failed because of an add-on.
You loot 5 gold, 15 silver, 81 copper. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Jinxed Hoodoo Skin. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. You receive loot, Jinxed Hoodoo Skin. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Mage Weave Cloths 2. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You loot 18 gold, 39 silver, 49 copper. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Ancient Tablet. Vertica Wildemer receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 3. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Fine Pointed Dagger. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Ancient Tablet. You loot 2 gold, 87 silver, 54 copper. Vertica Wildemer receives loot, Ancient Tablet. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Roasted Basilisk Skin.
This desert be mine.
Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Rigid Basilisk Fang. You receive loot, Roasted Basilisk Skinks 4. You receive loot, Whetted Claymore.
Stralsum has died.
The Sand Fury reigns supreme. Feel the fury of the sand.
You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X10. You receive currency, Bronze Celebration Tokens 2. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Mage Weave Cloths 4. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Roasted Basilisk Skinks 2. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Mageweave Cloths 3. Asmongus Ragnaros receives loot, Ancient Time Warp Scroll. Strolsum Ragnaros receives loot, Sentinel Musket. Fast Demon Ragnaros receives loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Ripsaw. You receive loot, Troll Sweat. You receive loot, Mageweave Cloths 2. You receive currency, Time Warp Badge X20. You receive currency, Valor Stonus 20. You loot 33 gold, 96 silver, 33 copper. You receive currency, Weathered Harbinger Crests 5. Vertica Wildamer receives loot, Big Bad Pauldrons.
Stralsum Ragnaros has left the instance group. Fast Demon Ragnaros has left the instance group. You leave the group.